Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. So good morning, everyone, and welcome. It's a pleasure to be here in Brussels, chairing this very important session on the Biological Weapons Convention at 50. So talking about reflecting on the achievements, the gaps, and the road ahead. I am a senior research leader for RAND Europe. It's a not-for-profit research organization. I work on emergent technologies. I come at it from a very different perspective, which can be interesting. A lot of my work is focused on security policy, societal resilience, spanning things like BWC, mirror life, AI and bioconvergence, and technology capability assessments. So as we mark half a century since the convention entered into force, we're reflecting on both the lessons, but also the pathways ahead. The world today looks profoundly different to what it did 50 years ago. And so technologies are shaping what really constitutes now a biological threat. The landscape is very different. So while geopolitical tensions challenge our cooperative instincts, we've seen some extraordinary efforts of late, national and international, to prevent weaponization, to enhance surveillance, detection capabilities, and to strengthen deterrence through capability building. So yesterday we had really interesting discussions centered on nuclear non-proliferation and risk reduction. And while, yes, the biological domain does differ, there are some cross-cutting lessons here. So in some respects, maybe civil nuclear governance may need to learn from the paradigms of biological governance, given its dual-use nature. So with that framing, I'm really delighted to introduce our panelists, who bring scientific, diplomatic, policy expertise from across the world. I would like to introduce Dr. Irma Macalinau, who's the Professor of Pharmacology and Toxicology, Coordinator for CBRN Health Security Initiatives at the University of Philippines. She has championed biological and chemical weapons non-proliferation and contributed extensively to the implementation of the BWC, promoting confidence-building measures and South-to-South cooperation in CBRN risk reduction. I am also joined by Ambassador Bencini, who's the permanent representative of Italy to the Conference on Disarmament. And he was, from 2019 to 22, he was head of strategy of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Rome and in charge of global health issues, coordinating Italy's contribution to the international response to COVID-19 pandemic. And he was the president of the 9th Review Conference of the BWC in 22. Then we have next to Ambassador Bencini, Dr. Una Jacob. It's delighted to have her here. She's a senior researcher and head of the research group Biological and Chemical Disarmament and Security at the Peace Research Institute Frankfurt. Dr. Jacob is a member of the Joint Committee on the Handling of Security Relevant Research of the German Research Foundation and German National Academy of Sciences and CEPI's Biosecurity Strategy Group. She is an advisor to the German delegates to the BWC. And finally, last but by no means the least, we have Ambassador Meyer, who's the permanent representative of Brazil to the Conference on Disarmament, and with a flourishing diplomatic career over the last 45 years across many parts of the world. He is the chairperson of the working group on strengthening the BWC, and we are very much excited to seeing what the next set of meetings bring to us. So in terms of the panel, what I'd like to do is pose an individually tailored question to each of our panelists, drawing on their expertise, so you get to really hear their views on specific issues. And then we will have a bit of a back and forth between the panelists, and then we'll open up the Q&A for the audience. So I'd like to start with Dr. Irma, yourself. And the question I have for you is, based on the work that you've done, you've long championed regional capacity building and South-to-South cooperation in biosafety and health security. So as the BWC looks forward to the next 50 years, what kind of practical mechanisms do you think state parties should prioritize to ensure that national health systems, particularly in the Global South, can be embedded in BWC implementation rather than only engaged during crisis time?
Mike. So, good morning, everyone. And since I'm actually taking the floor for the very first time in this conference, I'd just like to say thank you to the organizers for bringing me all the way from the Philippines to this conference. So, again, when we talk about the Biological Weapons Convention and the Global South, it's always very interesting to remember that when we talk about the public health security aspect, we need to be able to also think about the international health regulation. So between the Biological Weapons Convention and the international health regulation, there is something there that is actually going to affect both the public health and the security clusters. So we have seen that in the COVID-19 pandemic, the public health emergency of international concern was actually declared through the mechanism of the IHR. And when we talk about the importance of the training programs that are now existing in the Global South, we can actually see that this particular training programs on biosafety and biosecurity certainly had impacts on the way we have responded to COVID-19. Giving you a very specific example, when we did our laboratories for COVID-19, and that is in the public health realm, we utilized what we had been trained for on biosafety and biosecurity, and recognized also that in some of the countries of the world, it is not always the biosafety level 3 that exists, but if you look at what we have in terms of what the World Health Organization also espouses on training the people with low resource setting on how we can actually do a risk-based approach, that is something that we have learned over time. So when we think about biosafety and biosecurity, we are actually cognizant of the fact that it was sometime in 2003 that the Biological Weapons Convention, through the meeting of experts, actually talked about these items called biosafety and biosecurity. And you know how difficult it is for some languages because there's really no different translation for the words biosafety and biosecurity. In Indonesia, for example, they mean the same thing. So the common understanding that people reached in the meeting of the state parties is actually found in some of the working papers of the Biological Weapons Convention. And briefly, people understood that when we talk about biosafety, this is really protecting people, from dangerous pathogens, and of course, very simply, the biosecurity is the one that talks about protecting pathogens from dangerous people. And when we talk about this, we really are thinking about diversion, theft, and the like. So given the way the IHR also talks about biosafety and biosecurity, the Philippines, for example, and in countries in Southeast Asia, and I'm sure in other parts of the world, there is what we call the Joint External Evaluation. This is a tool that was developed in line with the IHR, but there are specific provisions on biosafety and biosecurity that is actually going to help both. For example, if there is a release of an organism that is unknown and it is going to cause a public health emergency or even less people involved in this kind of an emergency, this particular training for laboratories that are part of the IHR, the important capacity building, that can also be utilized for a deliberate release of a biological agent. So when we talk about the biological weapons, we are really hoping that the countries in the Global South can benefit from Article 10. The Philippines, for example, has contributed financially to Article 10 database because we realize that Article 10 for international cooperation and assistance is really very important for the Global South because it will provide them with technology transfer, knowledge, and the like, which is really very important as we respond both for the deliberate or the accidental, or who knows which particular origin is actually being considered for a certain biological event. So given that kind of a scenario, we recognize that the Biological Weapons Convention, while it was actually something that came up in 1972 and the IHR came out in 2005, that both of them will have benefits in terms of capacity building for the Global South. And it is not only for the Global South, but for humanity in general, because it actually talks about protecting people, and there is a common approach that is now being recommended for both the BWC and the IHR in as far as biological agents are concerned, and this is embodied in what we call the One Health approach. The One Health approach brings to mind not only human pathogens, but you talk about animal health, environmental health, And so the interface of the three elements become very important. The other thing, which I hope we will have a chance to really discuss, is really the emergence of technology that now facilitates the possible creation of a bioweapon. So within the Biological Weapons Convention, we talk about indirectly the dual-use research of concern, which is now something that even in the Global South, we know that there are now companies that really look at DNA synthesis, and just last week there was a meeting specifically dealing with DNA synthesis, trying to look for guidance on how best to use DNA and the technology without causing the creation of a bioweapon. So given that kind of a discussion, we also realized that in the issue of science and diplomacy, and we had this interesting discussion just before this panel started, that these two may actually be separate, but I come from the background of science. I started working with the BWC in 2009 accidentally, because I have been working on the area of toxins for a long time. So with that area of work that I do on toxins, I realized that the T in the Biological Weapons and Toxins Convention is a very important thing in the Global South as well. Because we have the abundance of natural toxins, which can really be the building blocks for therapeutics. For example, when we talk about the cone shells, conotoxin is found in the cone shells, and that is now developed into a drug for pain medicine. Similarly, there may be other types of biotoxins that really has a convergence with the Chemical Weapons Convention that have therapeutic potential. So when we talk about dual-use research of concern and the development probably of medical countermeasures in the future, then we have to think in terms of both the Biological Weapons Convention, the IHR, and the other developments in science and technology, which may in a way be good and at the same time be dealt with because there can be harm related to it. And just for before passing it on back to our moderator, I just want to say that under the EU CBRN Centers of Excellence initiative, we have had several trainings on biosafety and biosecurity. We also had done workshops under the EU Council decision for the developing countries in relation to science and technology. And we recognize the importance of horizon scanning for the developments of science and technology, which may be relevant to the convention. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Irma. So I think those are some really interesting parallels that you've drawn. I will reserve my questions until the end, but linked to some of the things that you've said around horizon scanning, perhaps I'll go to Dr. Una Jacob next, because I've got a slightly relevant and linked question for you. So we talk a lot about technological advancements, and with the advances that we've seen in synthetic biology and AI-enabled biological design, given that just a couple of months ago, we've just had the instance where AI-powered tools were able to generate a whole live virus, a bacteriophage, in the lab, and it performed basically better than a naturally occurring bacteriophage. And bacteriophages are viruses that basically kill bacteria, which is great for antimicrobial resistance, but it kind of demonstrates the kind of place we're at in the capabilities. And so with that in mind, it feels like ambiguity in outbreak origin might only grow. And we saw that play out in COVID as well. So I'd love your perspective on what reforms do you think, whether they're institutional, technical, political, do you think are essential to strengthen the international mechanisms for investigating alleged biological use without triggering geopolitical mistrust or securitization of the global health agenda?
Yes, thank you. Thanks, Sana, for that challenging question, but also for your kind introduction, and to the organizers for inviting me to be part of this distinguished panel. I'm very glad to be here, and before I start, let me just mention that I'm speaking here in my personal capacity as PRIF researcher. Let me start with maybe the ambiguity in disease outbreak, and just for those of you who are not that familiar with the field, that ambiguity comes from the fact that disease outbreaks can be natural, of course, or accidental or deliberate. it's important for various reasons to distinguish between the three, but in practice it's not always that easy, and we've also seen that with the COVID origin debate, which I'm not going to go into here. So yes, I'd agree that SNTs, or scientific and technological advances, can make things even more difficult, but I think it's also important to keep in mind that's only part of the picture, that nature does a lot of that work for us, and we don't even need like cutting-edge technology, because we see newly emerging diseases, we see changes in host range of existing diseases for various reasons, and we see that combined with advances in research that's basically designed to tackle that problem. But because so much of that research is dual use, and we've heard about the term just now, this makes it even more complex and even more complicated. So it's not just the technological advantages as such, but the combination with the nature of things in the double sense of the word. And that's what we're dealing with here. And because that's not complicated enough as it is, we also need to consider the political context in which these things happen. So if you have an outbreak of a disease in a very peaceful part of the world where there are no tensions, the whole situation will look very different than if we have an outbreak in a region where there is pre-existing tension and there are political animosities and things like that. And in that case, you can have an added dimension, because there might be suspicion because there are tensions anyway, or someone might actually exploit the situation and say, oh wow, this gives me a good tool to advance my own geopolitical whatever interests, and that actor could use an ambiguous outbreak to sow suspicion, even if there might not be that much reasons for it, or to spread disinformation around it for political gain. So just to illustrate that we're dealing with a very complex setting and have to look at different dimensions of the problem. It's probably not a surprise to say that we don't have one single mechanism to deal with all of this at the moment. And I'm not sure if we should aim for one, but that's a different discussion, not for here, because of the complexities. And even if we wanted to establish something new that could cover parts of that problem, or maybe even all of that, in the current international situations, it would be very difficult to set up something new. So I'm not saying we shouldn't aim for it, and I think it's worth keeping long-term objectives in mind, and that could be in the context of verification for the BWC or something completely new, or, yeah, could think of a range of things. But for now, because of the situation we're in, and because, as you said, we're dealing with a growing problem, I think it's important to focus on what we have here and see how far this gets us and how we can improve and stabilize the mechanisms that we have. So what do we have? In terms of disease outbreaks, of course, the WHO or FAO would be the first international actors to deal with that from an epidemiological perspective. But their mandates are apolitical, so they wouldn't get involved in an investigation, or they wouldn't be the lead in an investigation of a more political character, or if it's about deliberate use. Of course, their expertise could be used and things like that, but on a leading level, that would not be their mandate to investigate. The BWC prohibits, well, indirectly, but covers the use of biological weapons, not in the treaty text, but by political understanding, but it doesn't have any independent investigation capacities. So there are some options through the UN Security Council, but I think it's quite obvious why that's not very helpful at the moment. And there are discussions about discussing verification, and in that framework we might get to a point where we discuss investigation mechanisms, but you can hear the conditionality here, so it's all a long-term process, and we'll hear more about that later, I think, so I won't go into that here now. So what we have is the UN Secretary General's mechanism for investigation of alleged biological and chemical weapons use, long title, so the UNSGM. That's not related to the BWC. It's based on the Geneva Protocol that prohibits chemical and biological weapons use in warfare, and on international customary law. So that's outside the treaty, and it's not really connected with the Security Council. I think these are two important things. I don't have time to go into detail. I'm happy to answer questions about the UN-SGM as such. Maybe just to give you an idea, it's under the authority of the UN Secretary General, obviously. It's not a standing mechanism, but the SG can draw on experts that are nominated by UN member states if there is a request for an investigation, and then there are procedures according to which the investigation would be carried out. So that's all there, and it's functioning. But of course, things can always be improved. So I think one answer to your question is, let's make sure that the UN-SGM is as effective as possible, which means training, improving it on the operational side, but it also means protecting it from attacks, because there are some political efforts to undermine its credibility, to make it more dependent on UN Security Council approval, or put it under that authority. And I hope that I've made clear why it's important to have an independent mechanism, and this is basically the only thing we have at hand right now, so it's really important, I think, to maintain and safeguard that. Another aspect, or sort of your related questions about, so that's covering the institutional part, I think, of your question, and the political side. In terms of technology, I think this is a case where it's good to look at the opportunities that S&T developments provide us with. I mean, it's important to look at the risks in the dual use area and all of that, but I think here we can really look for ways to identify opportunities. So how can emerging technologies, AI of course, but maybe also others, support investigations, help with detection, help with forensics, and also, and that brings me to another aspect, attribution. And the logical question would be, okay, who could do that and where could that happen? I mean, we'll also probably hear about plans to establish an S&T review mechanism for the BWC. But I think this is also actually a role for us, academia, researchers, NGOs, to support that work, to look for screen technologies with that lens and see where there are chances to do that. Attribution, I just mentioned that. I think that falls between the technological and the institutional side. That is something that we're not very strong at the moment in the biological field. There are some lessons to be drawn, I think, from the chemical field in relation to investigations carried out on the Syrian chemical weapons attacks. But we don't have an organization like the OPCW, so we can't just copy these approaches, but still I think it would be worthwhile to look at that and see how we can find ways. Because even if we have an investigation and it's carried out and it gets to results and it confirms an attack, at the moment we're kind of stuck there. There is the UN Security Council, technically responsible for any follow-up action, but in practice, it's not very promising to go that way. So we don't have strong mechanisms for attribution, and we don't really have procedures to create accountability after an attack. So I think that, again, would be an area where we need to get stronger in the biological field. The geopolitical mistrust and securitization, these are tricky parts of your question. You asked how we prevent that. I'm not sure we can, because the geopolitical mistrust is there. And I think global health is securitized to a certain extent. And we just heard about the One Health approach, and I'm not criticizing that, but of course it brings the areas closer together. So for geopolitical mistrust, I think this is more an argument to support investigations, because if something can help reduce or prevent increasing political tension, then it's independent investigations, because at least it can take, I don't know if that's an English expression, in German we say take the wind out of the sails of spurious allegations, of disinformation campaigns, and maybe with actors that kind of sit on the fence and watch a conflict, they have a source of information if we have that. So I think the question of investigations is not primarily how we design them so they won't increase geopolitical tension, but rather how we use them to reduce geopolitical tension. And I think, independent and impartial investigations can do part of the job. And securitization, that's my last point. I think we can't help. We have to deal with the fact that health is securitized and biosecurity is healthicized. I know that's not a word. Because of the overlap in biosecurity, because of the dual-use research. So I think what we can do is make sure that we focus on the issue at hand, try not to generalize too much, but really, and stick to, like, where it's possible, stick to health as pure health, and also in the area of the BWC and disarmament, stick to those parts of health and those aspects that really are connected with biological disarmament and not go beyond. And that's, I think, as far as we can get to rein in the securitization, but I think that's something we have to live with. So I guess that's that, and I leave it here, and I'm looking forward to the other panel contributions and also to the discussion later on. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you so much. So speaking of geopolitical tensions, I'd like to go to Ambassador Bencini next. So as someone who shepherded state parties, if I may say so, through the 9th Review Conference, I'd love to hear your views on how you think we can build up diplomatic momentum and trust, given the current working group outputs on compliance verification. So even if a full regime might not be politically feasible in the near term, what are the things that you think we should be aiming for to demonstrate seriousness about this issue and create a bridge towards 2027 to the 10th RevCon?
Thank you. Thank you for having me here and for your question. I would like to say that, to start by saying that sometimes what I'm going to talk about is the diplomatic process, and sometimes scientific considerations. The scientific world in general sometimes, unfortunately, is separate from the diplomatic world and the diplomatic process. And is this the same microphone that wasn't working earlier? So I'm sure that a lot of people in this room know more about biological weapons than I do. We have to make an effort to sort of bridge the gap between the two worlds. We tried to do that at the review conference. I'm going to say a few words about what happened there. Basically, the BWC is the only international instrument concerning weapons of mass destruction without an implementing agency. So you have the NPT, and they have the IAEA, you have the Chemical Weapons Convention, and they have the OPCW, and the BWC is the only one without an implementing agency. So this is a very serious limitation that we have in the BWC. So the goal of the review conference at the time was not just to review the implementation of the convention, but also to find ways to strengthen the institutional framework of the convention, basically to lay the groundwork to have in future some sort of implementing agency, which is why we agreed on the two mechanisms, one on Article 10, international cooperation and assistance, and the other one on science and technology. So I think those were perhaps the main achievement of there were two achievements of the review conference. One was that decision to establish those two, to develop with a view to establishing. See, if you read the diplomatic language, how convoluted it is. What does that mean, really? You know, so we decided to basically to establish sooner rather than later, these two mechanisms. And the other one was that we mentioned the verification again after 21 years or so. So those were the two main achievements of the review. And we established a working group that now is led by Ambassador Meyer, and of course, needless to say, we fully support Ambassador Meyer's efforts, and And we also want to move forward as fast as possible, hopefully achieve something by next year. But I'm going to go back to that a minute later. So this is what we wanted to have, the mechanisms. And I think we've worked a lot on those two mechanisms. And I think we're close to an agreement. This is the goal that we should aim at, which is to, again, supporting the chair to at a special conference to be convened possibly next year. We know it's very difficult, but we're going to try to establish the two mechanisms, and at the same time to decide to establish a new working group to discuss the issue of verification. So the two mechanisms, we have to be aware of one thing, is that everything costs money. And now it's a very difficult moment. The UN system, the broader UN system is under strain. I was talking to someone at the UN headquarters the other day dealing with, actually I can tell you, he's the Italian member of the ACABQ. So I was talking about the risks that the organization is running. I mean, if a major contributor to the UN budget decided to stop paying its dues, then the UN would go bust within 2 years, would go bankrupt, would go bust, like a major corporation going bust. It's not going to happen, but we're living through very difficult times, and we have to be aware of that. We're trying to cut costs everywhere. And so this is really a difficult moment to try something ambitious. So if you have whatever mechanism you're going to have, it's going to cost money. I remember at the review conference we were negotiating with Iran on adding a number of units of personnel to the ISU. So we negotiated, we wanted two more people, and then eventually we agreed on one. We're talking about this. We're talking about a budget that's $2 million US, maybe not even 2 million. And when you compare this with the risks that we're facing, it's completely imbalanced. It doesn't make sense. And even if we establish a mechanism of international cooperation and assistance, that's going to be a drop in the ocean. It's going to be a drop in the ocean. It's not going to make any serious difference. We have to be aware of this. And it's not a given. I mean, there are still outstanding issues. There are countries that would like to see this mechanism as something that discusses sanctions regime, export control regimes. This is not what we want. Non-starter for us. This is a political aspect, or what I was talking about. This has nothing to do really with biological weapons. It has to do with politics, just that. But this is going to might stop whatever progress we can make on this issue. So, and also another aspect, you have to have the donor community putting funds into this. And are they ready to do it at this point in time? Or will they do it if they see that this body, this mechanism might be used against them? No, of course not. So this is a very, when you talk about something like this, implementation of Article 10, we know how important it would be for developing countries, which is why we wanted it, and we wanted to establish it at the review conference. But there was no agreement. But we were ready to do it at the review conference. Many delegations were ready to do it. So there's still some work to do on this. And again, it's not going to be a game changer, even if we manage to establish it. But at least it will be a start, a move in the right direction towards the establishment in future of an organization, of an implementing agency, or whatever you want to call it. The other one is a science and technology mechanism. And this is very important. We keep repeating the argument that we need scientists to tell us what we're talking about. This is very important. Technology moves very fast. We need to know what the risks are, what we can do about them, how we can verify implementation and compliance. So we need scientists. So we need a body that's made up of real scientists, not fake scientists. And when I say this, it's because sometimes you have, groups of intergovernmental experts. They're not experts, they're diplomats. Now, in this one, we need scientists. We need scientists. And this is very important, because if we don't have people who tell us exactly where the science is, then we're not going to make any good decisions. We need to make informed decisions. So this is a very important point. And again, also on that mechanism, there are some outstanding issues. I hope that with the efforts of our chair, we might overcome the last hurdles and aim for a consensual outcome. Surely we're going to try and get that by 20. We were supposed to have this conference in 2025, 50 years since the entry into force of the convention, 100 years since the Geneva Convention. So it was the good year to do it. We're not going to have it this year, of course. But we have to have something before the next review conference. And then the other issue, we have to decide the way forward on compliance and verification. Let's be honest, there is a long, long way to go on compliance and verification. This topic hasn't been discussed in many years. We started again 3 years ago. We're very far apart. There are countries that think, no, we have to go back to we have to work on an optional protocol like we did in 2000, 2001. That's the way to go. Others say, no, the technology has changed too much. We have to have a creative approach, a new approach. We have to look at this with a fresh pair of eyes. These might be negotiating positions, we don't know, but certainly there is a long way to go. We need to discuss this further. Certainly, we have to think of some kind of future verification regime, and this is why we need the mechanism, the science and technology mechanism. If we had that mechanism, we could ask the scientists in it, so tell us, what's the best way to deal with the verification? We need to know, we need to have options, technical, scientific options on how to do this. But there are many obstacles in the past. One of those was that it's very easy to verify nuclear, well, it's not very easy, but it's easier to verify nuclear disarmament, because first you have, if you want to develop a nuclear weapons program, you have to have fissile material. It's not so easy to acquire. You have to enrich uranium. You have to have centrifuges. See Iran, for instance, in a situation in Iran. So, there are ways to sort of monitor that. If a country does manage to acquire fissile material and develops a nuclear weapon, then they have to have a delivery system. So that's another question that, something you can monitor. And then if they carry out a test, immediately, because we have the monitoring stations of the CTBTO. So it's easier to monitor. Chemical weapons might be easier to develop, but still they're also easier to monitor than biological weapons. Biological weapons, I was told during the RIF conference, that all you need is a laboratory, a small laboratory in somewhere hidden somewhere, and from that laboratory you could develop a pathogen that could kill the entire human population. So, and that's easy to hide, it's easy to conceal, and very difficult to find and verify. So whatever system we have in future, it will have to start from this. I don't know if this is completely true, but this was one of the arguments that were used when we were discussing verification. Again, we have to start discussing this again with scientific advice. But this will come after I hope we can agree on the two mechanisms. I'll stop now, so maybe we can pick up some of the issues later.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That was really spot on some of the challenges that we see forthcoming, and where Ambassador Mayer has the unenviable task of chairing upcoming meetings to move the needle on some of the issues that you've raised, Ambassador Bencini. So I come to you, Ambassador Mayer, with a question on beyond the technical debate on verification. We have to move forward on some of the shared priorities that were mentioned on international assistance, capacity building, peaceful cooperation, and establishing a science and technology mechanism. What do you think are the means, or what's the foundation for creating consensus in the working group? And what diplomatic strategies do you think will be required to convert these priorities into a meaningful outcome over the next course of the meetings and the next year as well?
Well, thank you, and thank you for the invitation. I would just like to make a remark, because we are talking about disarmament, and there's my friend Filipa remind me, nobody mentioned that today is 11/11/11. So on the 11th of November at 11 o'clock, the First World War ended. And we are discussing disarmament, and there was no reference whatsoever about it. So just thank you, Filipa. I had an intervention prepared here, but I will just let myself answer you. How to get consensus? That's $8 million. You see, once I've been dealing with it, with the BWC, since I arrived in Geneva June last year. And the problem is, so far, I was able to avoid political questions in the room, because that's the big thing, you know? You have doesn't matter what, if one delegation says that this ceiling is white, some delegation will say, no, it's not white, you have some lamps here too. And so it's been very difficult to finalize the work. I want to finalize the work in December, and I would like to thank my colleague Leonardo for supporting me, and for a lot of members of the European Union for supporting the chair. But we still have some question marks, you know? Well, this is not a public thing, right? Okay. So we have two major problems. I think we have two major problems now. First of all, we have Russia, that we never, they destroyed the meeting last December, and we don't know what's going to come with them. On private meetings, I have kept some bilaterals with some delegations. They all say they support me, not like you, Leonard. I know you support me. But the others, they say, oh, we support, and when it's in the room, the scene is totally different. The other question mark is the Americans. We don't know their position. You see, it's the American diplomats were very much surprised, as I was, with the statement of President Trump in New York in the general debate, because the person who was in charge of BWC in the Department of State, Ken, he was, I think, doing this kind of work since 1925. You know, he was a good expert. He knew everything. He has been all the meetings and so on, and he was retired. Then the deputy refused to work with the new administration. So at the time of the general debate, there was no one responsible for biological weapons. So they don't even know from where that reference came. So those are the two big question marks.
Can you recall the reference by the president, by Trump?
Oh, he said that we should use artificial intelligence for verification on biological weapons and so on. Anyway, so of course, you have some countries which are more active in a way or another, be Germany, be France, be Iran, be Cuba, Belarus, always supporting Russia, Italy, and in Latin America you have Panama and Mexico. But the room wants to finish the work. I can say that. But you still have about 5% who, with reasons or without reasons. You see, you know that, as you can imagine, the unilateral measures for Cuba, Iran, China not so much, but Cuba, Iran, Russia, Venezuela, it's something very important for them. But in my opinion, this is not a reason not to have the conclusion in December. We just had a meeting of UNCTAD in Geneva a couple of months ago, where there is a reference to unilateral measures that was accepted by the Americans, by the Europeans, by Iran, by Russia. So if we have the goodwill, we can finish in December. I really think it's because, see, we don't have to invent the wheel. This is very typical that diplomats always repeat this, but it's the truth, you know, because, for instance, I was in New York for the first committee. The new administration does not accept any reference to gender balance, you see? But let's first think, if there is a biological weapon incident, everybody's going to die, be a woman, trans, animal, plant, whatever. So should we be discussing this kind of thing? I mean, it's important, but I think it's not the place. We're discussing the threat of biological weapons, not which genders or they're going to affect, or animals or plants, you see? So that's the first thing. And the second thing, gender balance, is accepted language of the UN. So there is no reason to invent things. And then also another point that the Americans are pressuring is on the environmental issues, you know? So are you going to convince me that if there is a biological disaster, the environment's not going to be affected? So how can you exclude environment in a discussion like this? You see, so, but again, we don't want to invent the wheel, but I think that we can overcome. If there is goodwill from countries, we can overcome that. It's not, I don't think it's a problem, you see? And it's about it. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your remarks. So I think the theme somewhat persists what you said, Ambassador Bencini, right? There's politics and then there's science, and I think we can see that clearly playing out. I have one question. Maybe I'd love a very quick 30-second to a minute perspective from all of you on this, and then we'll open it up for an audience Q&A. So a lot of you mentioned about the lack of instruments available to transact things like a independent mechanism outside of the UNSGM. We have a long way to go. A methodology to do verification, compliance, science and technology mechanism. We have made a lot of progress towards those things. Yet, you mentioned, Ambassador Bencini, there's a big divide between investment and the level of consequences. It seems disproportionate. And you mentioned that, people maybe don't want to invest in things that they don't trust or they feel like they might be used against them. Do you think that's the primary driver between the delta of investment versus the scale of consequences? And I'd love everybody, perhaps you can start, Ambassador Bencini, but I'd love everybody's very quick reflection on what do you think is the driver between the lack between investment versus consequences in this space particularly?
No, thank you for this question. I have to say that this is something I discuss all the time. There's not enough awareness. We don't have enough pressure from public opinion. In democratic countries, you have public opinion, then you have parliament and government. Government answers to parliament, to the people, to public opinion. But we don't have enough of that. I've seen it. I compare the biological field with the nuclear field, where you have a lot of NGOs, a lot of commitment. And here it's, we've talked about this with some of you quite a few times. It's a very niche area. And this is a strong limitation. And if we want to achieve something, we have to mobilize public opinion. We have to have pressure. We have to have pressure on governments. If we don't have that pressure, we won't achieve anything. So you have to be aware of this. People don't really see this as the risk that we are told it is. And this is one and the reason why, the second point I would like to make is that we haven't had, thankfully, but we haven't had a good moment like the Chemical Weapons Convention had. So when you have something like that, then of course it gives the motivation to find the money, develop mechanisms, find solutions. We haven't had that, and people in general don't think that we're going to have it. I mean, we might have another pandemic, but not a man-made one, not a biological weapon. So there is no awareness of the risk because we've had only a few cases of, a few victims of, few cases of use of biological weapons over in decades. So it's not felt as a real threat. And unless it is felt as a real threat, we want to have enough attention, enough pressure, and enough money. And without these three things, we won't achieve anything.
Dr. Emma, for your views on...
This particular question is something that I have been ruminating in my mind because in the Philippines, for example, for the third time, we have submitted the national implementation law for the Biological Weapons Convention. And despite the pandemic, we have not succeeded in passing the law. So which means that it is really low in the radar of the policy makers, the people in Congress who write the law. But still, we are hoping that we will be able to do this. So I think there's this element of persistence, education, and outreach that is actually something that must happen so that we can, again, bring this issue about the implementation law. We realize that in countries with the lack of legislation for the Biological Weapons Convention, it was very difficult for us to really say we know where the dangerous pathogens are, except perhaps for universities where we have our own institutional biosafety and biosecurity committee. So now we submitted again for the fourth time the draft bill to our policymakers, hoping that we can really drive them, giving now the examples of the emerging technologies that may make it easier for us to create the next weapon. And of course, we recognize with the pandemic that has happened with COVID-19, the importance of recognizing the disease as a weapon. So I think we just really have to have clear arguments. We call this the 2-minute elevator pitch for our policymakers so they can see the importance of having the implementation law.
Thank you. Ambassador Mayor, your quick reflection on why there is this big delta.
Yeah, I totally agree with my colleague because as President Lula said yesterday in the opening of COP30, we have $2 trillion to spend on weapons and we don't have 1.2 trillion to spend on the environment. So, makes it sense? No.
Dr. Una, your views on why you think?
Yes, thanks. Well, in addition to what my colleagues have just said, which I can totally relate and agree with, I think, in practical terms, when we look at the meetings, I think there are different reasons why countries raise the financial argument. I think for some it's a real practical concern. For others, it might be a matter of domestic priorities. And for others, it might be a pretext to stall negotiations. Or we don't have clearance on the financial aspect. We can't can't agree to anything. But that aside, I mean, that's the very, very practical, everyday, day-to-day business in the negotiations. I think one problem that we need to take into account is the general discourse and climate around arms control and disarmament, not specifically the BWC, but in general, that it's in many areas. I might be slightly projecting from a German discourse, but I don't think it's limited to that. The general feeling that arms control is not. It's not something that helps us at the moment. It's not functioning. It's not working. We have other security concerns, so it's not something you kind of score points with in domestic discussions and allocations of money. And I think that's a pity because I think it would be important to emphasize that with the BWC, we actually do have a disarmament instrument that's kind of working. With all the limitations and all the deficits and all the problems that we have, but we're having discussions, we're talking about establishing new things, and this is something very different from other fields of arms control. So I think it might be helpful to put the financial in that broader context and emphasize that this is worthwhile to invest money here, provided that money is there to be allocated in the first place, of course.
Thank you. That's a really positive reflection to conclude on. So thank you so much, the audience. You've been very patient and attentive. So I'd like to open up the floor for questions from you for our fantastic panelists. So
thank you for the fantastic panel. I'm an actual scientist based in Cambridge, and within the scientific community, there's a lot of chatter about this AI bioconvergence, and we've got new biological design tools coming up, and those are increasing the capabilities of scientists and non-state actors that could potentially create new pathogens, which could be quite dangerous, and we could have a scenario with engineered pandemics with catastrophic consequences. Within the BWC conversation, how are you guys implementing these AI capabilities in terms of risk verification and implementation? And I've got a second quick question. From my understanding, BWC is mostly concerned with state actors, but in terms of the non-state risks, is BWC concerned about the non-state actors potentially gaining access to biological weapons because of these rising AI bio capabilities?
thank you. Who would like to take that? Ambassador Bencini and then Ambassador Mayor? Yep.
The second question, especially. Well, there are two kinds of obligations within the BWC. One is a negative one, not to develop weapons of biological weapons, and the other one is a positive one, not to allow anyone in your territory to develop those weapons. So, which brings me to your question, non-state actors. This one of the things why we should have an international cooperation and assistance mechanism is actually to help those countries with all the necessary capabilities to sort of ensure that their laboratories are safe and secure. I think of an African country where you might have I don't know, civil war or something like that, then you would have a safety and security risk there, and you would have to have protocols on how to deal with that. So this is something that certainly is of concern. Perhaps not as much as the one, not as much as programs developed by states, because certainly, of course, there is a possibility for non-state actors, but the main focus originally was on states. But certainly, there is also a concern that terrorist groups might get hold of the necessary technology and develop biological weapons. On the AI, I'm not going to talk. This is one of the issues where I think one of the issues where we need the science and technology mechanism, because then we can ask them these questions.
Ambassador Mayer, would you like to add anything?
Yeah. On the AI, I tell you that for me, it's something that it became like a pattern. You ask anything, people mention AI. So I want to make a chocolate cake. Oh, the AI says, it's from I was in Almaty in a biological meeting 1 month ago, a few weeks ago, and I was very much impressed with a lecture of an American scientist who were talking about mirror technology. You should know it, which makes AI something so old-fashioned, So, and that's where I keep saying that diplomats, they walk much behind science. And so I think that, again, we have to go faster because AI is becoming very, very old-fashioned. Thank you.
Maybe we can start back over there.
Thank you very much for this really informative presentations, particularly for people like me, rather new on the topic. And I like to put up a question, maybe more on how to go about it, taking into account what it was said, that it is not perceived by the public opinion and by governments as a pressing issue, like nuclear or even chemical. And I was wondering whether you could go for a different strategy, maybe too much out of the box for the silo, in a way, system that we have in the UN, which is each conference for each convention and so on. Why I am saying that? Because as a former policymaker myself, if you go about it saying, okay, you are not paying sufficient attention to us, but this is also very dangerous, too much attention on nuclear and so on, too many NGOs on nuclear, yeah, okay, that will deliver something. But it's a bit, okay, now you have the bio crowd defending their topic of interest. Allow me the caricature. So, can we think of something like a joint special conference on the three topics, like nuclear, chemical, and biological, to come up with some sort of conclusion or a statement that basically at the end raises the bio at the level of attention and priority of the other two? Because of course for the general public, with a very average knowledge, is weapons of mass destruction, is nuclear, is chemical, is biological. No? Thank you.
So do you think there is the will and the appetite to bring parity across these paradigms?
No. There's also another reason why there's not enough awareness. Probably it's because from a military point of view, biological weapons, maybe now that we were talking about this before the seminar, but perhaps now the situation has changed, the technology has changed. Maybe now it's possible, but until recently it was very difficult to control a biological weapon. So it was very difficult to use it. And in 1968, when the United States, and actually was, yeah, I believe it was the United States, correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm sure some of you know more about the history of the WWC than I do, but basically there was a time when the two superpowers were discussing areas of cooperation, and they found the biological area because it was something that the military would tell them, look, we cannot use biological weapons, so you might as well ban them. And it was quite easy to get to a convention that agreed on banning an entire category of weapons, which we don't have with the NPT. The NPT does not ban nuclear weapons as such. It prescribes the abolition of nuclear weapons, but without saying when. Article 6 of the NPT. But the BWC is one of the few treaties that actually bans an entire category of weapons. So I think that there was also this technical military reason why they were not very top of the agenda, because they're difficult to use, difficult to control. They could turn against the side that uses them. If you have a pandemic that concerns everyone, so maybe now it's different. Maybe now you can have, I don't know, with DNA technology, different systems, you can invent the ultimate biological weapons. But again, this is a matter for scientists to tell us, is that possible? To my feeling, we're not there yet. And this is also the reason why they're not seen as a usable weapon. And then you don't have a doctrine, and you don't have, nuclear weapons, you've had decades of doctrines that were developed, the concept of deterrence and concepts like, no first use, launch on warning, things like that, make up the entire possible response to a nuclear attack or the use of nuclear weapons. So you have an entire literature on the use of nuclear weapons or non-use of nuclear weapons, on deterrence. You don't have anything quite like that on biological weapons. So this is also another reason why we're very much behind. We're very much behind on biological weapons, and you cannot compare them with other weapons of mass destruction.
Dr. Una, would you like to weigh in?
Yes, I agree with that. And also, I think I see the point about getting out of the silos and thinking more holistically. But I'm actually not sure if the attention that the nuclear field gets is the kind of attention that we want in the biological field. My feeling is we don't. And I'm not sure that we want to see more linkages between the two fields for exactly those reasons, that they're so different, but also for the political challenges associated with each of them. We have the linkages in the Middle East for other reasons, and it's not helpful. And then we have linkages, like as we heard before, in the biofield with health, which has been helpful, and I'm kind of a convert on that, because I used to be a bit more critical about this connection. But in hindsight, I still see the problems, but I also see the benefits that it's brought to the debates and the discussions. So I don't think linking the three, in inverted commas, weapons of mass destruction categories more closely together, especially in the current situation with all the nuclear discussions. I'm not sure if that's the way to go, but another idea probably would be to expand that even further. And I'm not saying, I'd have to think that through, but I would definitely not focus on those three categories. But if we want to get out of silos, it would probably have to be more holistic. Like, I don't know, we've had UN special sessions on disarmament before, or something like that. Might not be the right moment in time right now, but maybe something to keep in mind. So to really have a very broad out of the silo thinking, but probably not for those three categories.
Derma, please.
Maybe because I'm the only one from the Global South in this panel, I think it's important. The point raised a while ago is very important, because we saw this now in the development of what we call the CBRN National Action Plan. So we looked at the cross-cutting issues, and when we talk about the Biological Weapons Convention, we always now look at the convergence between the chemical weapons and the biological weapons, particularly in the issue of the toxins. It is hardly discussed. Most of the discussion on biological weapons always center on the microbial organisms, but in reality, we don't even need the high-tech technology. Maybe this is something that we should also be cautious about while we think about all this emerging technology. Maybe the low technology, the crude extraction from a natural toxin can still create something that can be a weapon if it is actually disseminated in some ways, like in the delivery systems of the water and the like. So I think the importance of being able to convince policymakers with examples that are also unique to the country or the region is also very important. So we may talk about AI and AI machine learning being able to synthesize these toxins faster now because of the technology, but at the same time, nature has made it for us. And so the crude extraction process, for example, saxitoxin on a regular red tide bloom, it's just there. And if a bad person is interested, they can always just get hold and do the extraction. And of course, up until recently in one of the countries in Southeast Asia, the attempt to use abrin, which is really a very toxic substance found in rosary pea beads, or this is Abrus precatorius, that's the scientific name. These are things that actually exist in nature, and therefore we must be able to discuss this also in the biological and chemical weapons convention sphere. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Carlo Trezza. I am the predecessor of these two brilliant diplomats here, diplomat ambassadors. First of all, I want to mention this question of putting the three weapons of mass destruction in the same basket. And I just want to mention that there are some instances in which they are, let's say, disciplined in the same framework. I think Una mentioned the NPT, the question of weapon-free, it's a weapons of mass destruction-free zone in the Middle East. They are putting them in the same basket, let's say. Very complicated, I must say. Resolution 1540 of the Security Council also mentioned them in the same, and there are other instances in any case. But where I see more of a convergence, as I think Dr. Irma said, is a convergence with chemical weapons. There, some similarities are there, and I think that around 20 years ago, let's say before COVID, in any case, there was an idea at a time when we thought that the chemical weapons were already and no longer a problem, that maybe biological weapons could be put under the, let's say, under the control of the OPCW. I would like to know whether, and there's also the precedent of course, the 1925 protocol, no? Which put them, it was for chemical and biological weapons. So do you think that there is this possibility today of reopening this option? Thank you.
I'll give the panelists a moment to reflect on that. So I have a quick reflection to share. You mentioned mirror life, mirror biology, for instance, Ambassador Mayer. So this is, for those of you aware, a category of biology which would be detrimental to everybody on this planet if it were to be achieved. And so in some respects, people don't want to compare it to nuclear, because it's counterintuitive, because the last thing you want it for something like that to turn into an arms race, to say X person has it, we must have it because we must have sovereignty and we must have strategic advantage. And so that strategic advantage sort of lens becomes very, very problematic and very dangerous for certain areas of biology. So that's my kind of reflection on, you know, the pros and cons and the waxing, waning conversations around alignment between the various categories of weapons of mass destruction. But yeah, are there panelists who would like to tackle that? Yeah, Ambassador Mayer, please.
Yeah, thank you. But to start with, how many countries can develop nuclear weapons compared to how many countries can develop biological or chemical weapons? I think even the capacity of countries are quite different. And also, I mean, I have a question that I don't find the answer, but why did the non-state actors that destroyed the World Trade Center, why they didn't use biological weapons in some water reservoirs in New York? It's something that I don't know. If you want to, but they could have a much bigger result poisoning the water of New York than doing what they did with those planes. But they didn't use it. Why? So I think that even we know that it's very easy to process biological weapons, you know. But I think there is quite a difference between the three.
Yes, please.
Yes, I would like to add something to this reflection. Yes, there are some areas where you have, in theory, you discussed the three categories of weapons together. The Middle East zone free of weapons of mass destruction is a case in point. But at the end of the day, people are mostly concerned about nuclear weapons, and there is a debate at the NPT meetings on nuclear weapons-free zones. There isn't an equivalent in the BWC meetings. So, but there is one major difference: is that nuclear weapons are legal, are still legal. The TPNW, the treaty that tries to ban them, I mean, it's been ratified by around 90 member states to the UN, but legally they exist for a start, and they are still legal. While biological weapons are illegal because you have 183 states parties to the BWC. In theory, there are no biological weapons. If everyone abides by the convention, there should be no weapons. We shouldn't worry about that. So, which is why the problem is verification of implementation and compliance to the convention. But so they're very different questions. And also chemical weapons, you know, they're banned and you cannot use them. But nuclear weapons, still to this day, technically speaking, from a legal point of view, they are legal, and in theory, they could be used. So it's a very different debate.
Dr. Una, I'll go to you last, and then I'll take one more question from the gentleman there.
Thanks. Yeah, just quickly to that question that Ambassador Tretzer just raised about not leaving out the nuclear, but combining the chem and bio parts. That actually got my political scientist head spinning. It's a fascinating question, I think. And if we look at the norms against both categories, like historically, they were kind of combined. It was like poisons, very broadly speaking, and like in ancient times, I mean, before we knew about viruses and bacteria and how to synthesize nerve agents and things like that. So there is kind of a relationship of something common, I think, and we still talk about, I mean, I don't know how many of us cover chem and bio, because somehow it's bound together. So I see the idea, and they used to be, I mean, before we had the BWC, the position was that the states wanted to negotiate a ban on chemical and biological weapons, and then they separated the two, but they had to be separated because they were combined in thinking before. But if we look at the world today, we have two separate treaties, we have two different regimes, and we have very different political challenges. So I think on a normative level, that would be easier to combine the two, and they're equally, there's a taboo against both, I would argue. So biological and chemical weapons are prohibited, full stop. But if we look at the Chemical Weapons Convention and the cases of chemical weapons use and the challenges there, and then the Biological Weapons Convention that doesn't have that kind of challenges at the moment. So in practical terms, I think that would be quite a task, and I'm not sure if it's helpful. Yes. I can't see how you would manage that in legal terms. And get the political support for that, and then you have the technical dimension that, like verifying or investigating anything related to biological weapons, is technically different from the chemical field. So you'd have to add a whole new set of expertise. So I'm just thinking very practically, also with the experience from real life diplomacy and not just my political science desk. I think that would be a very, very long and stony way, but I guess it's something that needs a little time to think through with all the consequences, if it's worthwhile to pursue that, or if it's too difficult and if it's easier to go separate ways.
Maybe since we're about to break for lunch, make for an interesting conversation over lunch to travel over that. Because we started 5 minutes late, I'll just take one last question, but if you could make your responses brief, and then we will proceed to lunch downstairs.
Thank you so much for this panel. It's a lovely conversation. My name is Bartu. I'm a biotech researcher at ETH Zurich. I have a background in neuroscience, and I've also worked in CBRN defense with NATO's CBRN Center. I have two questions. First one is for the Ambassador Mayer. It's great to hear that you were actually in Almaty regarding the Future Biosafety and Biosecurity Conference. Recently, we're seeing a lot of push from Kazakhstan, but also the BWC is trying to promote more work from Central Asia. There was also the regional workshop in Tashkent, I believe, 2 months ago. Looking forward to December, to the next working group, do you see the role of Central Asian countries or Kazakhstan in, as you stated, helping go over the final 5% in finishing the work? That's my first question. And my second question, I'll try to be brief. I know this doesn't really fall under the purview of the BWC, but all this conversation here was regarding prevention. Unfortunately, prevention is not enough. Protection and recovery is as important. And although the BWC and all these organizations are currently underfunded and there's a lot of budget constraints, are there still works or efforts to try to maintain capability and capacity building measures alongside the confidence building measures? Like, there's a lot of work that the EU is doing. I was just curious whether the BWC is trying to promote these conversations within its working group, or whether you try to do this within your own respective roles in your organizations. Thank you.
Thank you. If I could have some brief responses, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, thank you for your questions. By coincidence, I opened the Brazilian embassy in Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, and Kyrgyzstan. So I was the first ambassador there. And I think that they're going to have a very important role, because last Friday arrived in Geneva to be ambassador the former Minister of Foreign Affairs, ambassador in London, ambassador in Vienna, and he was until last week, he was the foreign affairs advisor of President Tokayev. And I mean, he's a personal friend of mine, not Tokayev, but Yerzhan. And Tokayev, the present president of Kazakhstan, he used to be at the time of the Soviet Union, he was the representative of the Secretary General in Geneva. So he's really a UN guy. And he's the one who has this idea of having an organization for BWC. So I really think they should, at least for Kazakhstan and also Kyrgyzstan, they should come with full power on the mission, inshallah.
Maybe I'll just ask your views, Dr. Irma, on the point around response and resilience building from a Global South perspective. Would you like to say anything in terms of how that space is looked at from a prevention versus countermeasure?
So maybe I can also share that under the last October 2024, the ASEAN Leaders Declaration on Biosafety and Biosecurity was actually passed. And so this was also something that talks about the creation of an ASEAN Center for Biosafety and Biosecurity. So there's also in the elements of that declaration, which can be found online, something that may relate to Article 1 of the Convention, Article 4, and Article 10. So in terms of response, preparedness and response, at least in the Global South, the EU CBRN Centers of Excellence has been doing projects, a lot of them, and now they're also not looking at just the first responder community, but the medical community. So there's a project called P98 that will take place, and we'll talk about medical countermeasures, responding, and if there's a biological release, that is something to consider. I think that's also there's a lot of help coming from the U.S. U.S. Department of Defense, Threat Reduction Agency, Department of State, and the like for response, preparedness, and recovery.
Thank you so much. So I think we'll proceed to lunch now. If I could ask everybody to take a moment to really thank our fantastic panelists.